My friends, what a spectacular offensive by Ukraine. Nobody's talking anymore about the Russian offensive against Pokrovsk, Toretsk. All eyes on Kursk. Currently, Ukrainian forces hold a 45-kilometer bridgehead inside Russia, with recon units as far as 21 kilometers forward in this direction, 22 kilometers northwards, and 12 kilometers there. They captured roughly 540 square kilometers within 7 days. Not 7 months like the Russian army, 7 days. Ukraine skillfully maneuvered its shock units to allow a breakthrough, and then quickly deployed their light armored vehicle component held in reserve to exploit it. All this while providing their assault formations with artillery strikes and even close air support from their F-16s. Who would have thought that we would see these images of Ukrainian vehicles driving through a Russian border checkpoint and literally invading Russian territory? And to deal with this humiliation, there are rumors of a new mobilization in Russia. Let's be honest, the Russians got clapped. Bled, Mr. President, after the rematch of Kharkov and Kursk, I hope we won't have to go through Moskva and Stalingrad as well. Today we'll go through a day-by-day analysis of Ukraine's blitzkrieg operation against Kursk Oblast, so that you can get the most comprehensive overview of what happened. Put simply, this surprise offensive by Ukraine is a masterpiece of maneuver warfare. Overall, the first week of the Ukrainian offensive in Kursk is a complete success. From a military perspective, with only a couple thousands of soldiers, the Ukrainian army achieved a complete breakthrough and made significant territorial gains, including 44 settlements. From a political perspective, Ukraine showed its Western partners that it can still win the war. Led by General Syrsky, the Ukrainian army learned a lot from its past mistakes. We can't even speak of the Ukrainian art of war. On the 24th of July, The Guardian released this interview with General Syrsky, Ukraine's commander-in-chief. I know we will win, and how. Ukraine's top general on turning the tables against Russia. Now I understand what he meant by turning the tables. Spoilers, the Kursk offensive could also backfire hard and turn into a battle of the bulge type of scenario. The problem for Ukraine is that its assault formations can either keep pounding inside Russia and penetrate even further. Why not aim for Kursk? But they'll need massive reinforcements for that, and ASAP. Or call it a win, pull out immediately, and avoid long-term consequences. Especially since Russian reinforcements are already converging towards Kursk. So many units are in their way, like these guys from Ossetia. Ukraine did gain a lot of ground between the towns of Koreneva and Sudzha, but the Russians are drawing them inside what is essentially potato fields. Ukraine's supply lines now stretch for over 20 kilometers, and they're sort of stuck in this cauldron. Meanwhile, the Russians are fighting hard to maintain control over these vital highways leading straight to Kursk. It's a big gamble, and I understand Ukraine's exaltation. I mean, they brought the war directly into enemy territory. One more thrust and Kursk is theirs. However, the nightmare scenario would be for the Russian army to launch a deadly counteroffensive on the flanks. For example, from the town of Klushkovo, and just crash the party. That's why at the moment, the Ukrainian command quickly redirected the offensive to clear out this sector. So yeah, in summary, Ukraine has 3 choices. Option 1, push even further and outflank Russian reserves. Option 2, stop there, dig in and consolidate. Option 3, withdraw. Although this last option would make sense militarily speaking, it will be difficult to explain from a political perspective. My friends, I know it took me some time to release this video, but remember that I always wait to make sure that the information I put out is the most accurate possible. So with that being said, thank you for your patience. Welcome to History Legends, and here are the latest news of the Russo-Ukraine war. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. As you know, some of my Ukraine videos have been targeted with limited or no ads. So make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal to keep the show running. Thank you to everyone that has already helped, and welcome to the headquarters. Background: Ukraine has learned a lot from its failures of the 2023 summer offensive against Zaporozhye. This time they would not underestimate the enemy, and they would carefully plan the operation in details. Lesson 1. The armed forces of Ukraine maintain operational secrecy. Everybody was shocked by this offensive. There was no trailer or prior announcements as to when and where they would attack. Not a single hint, actually. This time Zelensky even recorded videos with a sad face mentioning the words peace and negotiations. Turns out it was all maskirovka. We can also believe the SBU secret services also got rid of a number of informants working for the Russians. Now, from a technical perspective, during the summer of 2023, Russian satellites and intelligence services noticed this massive Ukrainian buildup days ahead in the open fields of Zaporozhye. This time, General Syrsky used the city of Sumy as a coordination center. It's a large urban area, 35 kilometers from the border, where they can camouflage a good number of forces without being detected. Even better, Sumy is surrounded by vast forests that can camouflage armored formations until the very last moment. Lesson 2. Drop NATO tactics. Throughout 2023, the armed forces of Ukraine tried very hard to mold their military into a NATO battle force. Long story short, it did not work. So General Syrsky decided to reuse the good old tactics that worked so well for him in the past, such as during the Kharkiv counteroffensive of 2022 and even the Bakhmut counteroffensive of 2023. The plan was to make use of Ukraine's excellent DRG sabotage units to infiltrate enemy lines at its weakest point, and then exploit the breakthrough with rapid light armored vehicles whose speed cancels out Russia's firepower advantage. Lesson 3. Bypass enemy fortifications. Unlike in the summer of 2023, this time they would not attack Russia's most fortified defensive lines. This attack on Kursk would allow Ukraine to benefit from a surprise effect and advance against a sector that was poorly defended. They would only have to face a disconnected network of trench bastions, anti-tank ditches, and minefields. Nothing substantial, and the few existing positions were poorly manned. The lack of Russian minefields also meant Ukraine needed less demining equipment for its operation. Lesson 4. Pack a punch. Ukraine also learned from its failed incursions into Kursk Oblast. On paper, these operations only involved the so-called Free Russian Volunteers, but in reality they were supported by various Ukrainian Special Ops forces and International Legion units. Overall, we're speaking of light infantry formations that lacked mobility and firepower. This time, Ukraine decided to triple the number of soldiers involved, and more importantly boosted these units by providing them extra firepower with more IVs and tanks to destroy enemy strongholds. Lesson 5. Attack earlier. I'm pretty sure General Syrsky remembers that his 2022 Kharkiv offensive fell short to be decisive because it was launched in September. 1 month later, everything came to a halt when all the vehicles got bogged down with the rain season. So this time, the attack was to start earlier. You put these 5 lessons together and you get the 2024 Kursk offensive. Emotional damage! Before we analyze all this day by day, it's important to remember that this battle still represented a serious gamble, as regrouping this task force and committing it towards Kursk meant weakening positions where the Russian army is making serious gains, like in Pokrovsk and Tarietsk. Even worse, as stated in this article by the Financial Times, some Ukrainian units gathered for this surprise attack were directly pulled out from the main front. I quote, "Denis had been rotated to the area from the eastern Donetsk region more than a week ago to take part in the offensive." That's how, since June 2024, columns of armored vehicles and trucks drove around Sumy, with a white triangle painted on them. Some of Ukraine's most capable units were secretly preparing the invasion of Russia. Alea Yakta Est. Day 1, August 6. The Ukrainian offensive started with an intense artillery barrage and at least 26 drone strikes, mostly against the town of Sudzha. In the first hours of the day, Small Ukrainian sabotage units called DRGs pushed across the border. These light infantry units could advance almost undetected across forested areas, and their objective was to create chaos behind enemy lines. They were shortly followed by the first wave of this armored attack force. That's how one of these Ukrainian striker mine-clearing vehicles created a breach in the border's minefields, which allowed for this task force to start crossing the border into Russia. Due to the fog of war, many reports mentioned 2 brigades, even more. In reality, from what I read, it was closer to 2 battalions belonging to 2 different brigades. Who knows, maybe it was done on purpose to mess with the Russians. But at this stage of the war, brigades are not fighting at full strength, and all their battalions are rarely sent together as a single unit. So whenever people say X brigade was spotted here and there, it could mean anything from a UAV platoon to a company of 100 soldiers, a battalion, or even a full brigade advancing with thousands of personnel and hundreds of vehicles. The task to break through was given to a battalion of the 22nd Mechanized Brigade. This assault detachment was upgraded by a number of armored platoons, equipped with tanks like this PT-91 Twardy. They crossed here, here, and here. You can even see some drone footage of this large column of armored vehicles the moment they crossed the border. Their objective must have been to push the breachhead as far as possible. That's how they advanced towards Lebedivka and Darino. It was also mentioned that in the first stages of the battle they captured 29 Russian border troops. Meanwhile, a 2nd Battalion Tactical Group attacked in the south to push towards Sudzha along the R200 road. Here's footage of these guys crossing the Russian border. From the video we have about this border checkpoint, it's clear heavy fighting took place there. It wasn't as easy as the Ukrainians make it seem. It's unclear whether they belong to the 80th Air Assault Brigade or the 88th Mechanized Brigade. The Ukrainians also sent an assault detachment forward to break open the R200 road. For kickoff, a combat unit of 3 Ukrainian tanks supported by infantry stormed the border checkpoint. They captured the position but failed to exploit their victory, as the Russian garrison managed to withdraw a couple hundred meters back. In the end, the Ukrainians crossed the border through 6 locations. Overall, the operational objective was to secure the Sudzha-Rylsk highway and capture the towns of Sudzha and Kareneva, as Ukrainian DRGs and recon units pushed as far as possible forward. These forward elements of the Ukrainian army would then surprise and ambush the Russian reinforcements rushed to the border. Like these Russian tanks destroyed as they were still being transported by heavy equipment transporters. Meanwhile, the 2nd and 3rd wave of Ukrainian forces would handle the remaining strongholds and Ctrl-Alt-Delete them. That's how a number of Russian positions got outmaneuvered and encircled. They did fight, but the moment they were out of ammo, it was GG well played. Meanwhile, other units understood what was happening and tactically withdrew from the area. Overall, the situation became a nightmare for Russia. They simply underestimated the Ukrainians, thinking they would never dare to pull off such a move. And for this reason, they had no tactical reserves readily available in the Kursk sector. Of course, the Russian armed forces wanted to make use of their firepower to halt this incursion, but the first task was to spot enemy formations. It was very hard because you had hundreds of small armored columns just spreading across the Russian countryside. On top of that, most of the Russian drones were jammed by a very effective electronic warfare coverage by Ukrainian forces, thus leaving the Russian army blind. It's not a surprise that on the 18th of July, we learned that the 22nd Mechanized Brigade received dozens of Zenitsia electronic warfare systems. As Ukrainian armored formations pushed out of reach of their own electronic warfare assets, only then Russian UAVs started to become more efficient. Here they spotted a unit of 4 Striker armored personnel carriers that was geolocated 7 kilometers from the border, near the village of Zeleny Shliach. This MRAP, filled with 7 fully equipped Ukrainian soldiers, got hit by a drone, and everyone aboard the Canadian-made Russian Senator quickly ran for cover in the nearest tree line. Now, since the infantry component was safe, they could simply be picked up by another MRAP coming from the rear and continue the offensive. The word of the day was speed, forward, vorwärts. Now, since there were barely any Russian troops to physically stop the Ukrainian offensive, Ka-52 helicopters acted as first responders. However, these attacks at close range came at a risk. It was reported that during the first day, 3 Ka-52 helicopters were destroyed or damaged. Some of them could have been shot down by 2 K-22 Tungsta anti-aircraft guns that accompanied the columns. By 8 p.m., Russian reports were shocked and terrified by the large amount of enemy forces deployed for this raid, especially the presence of numerous armored units. This was serious. It wasn't about pretending to be free Russian light infantry and sabotage units anymore, but a full-on offensive by the armed forces of Ukraine. But it also means they got the green light to do so by Daddy. We can also partly explain Russia's slow reaction because Ukraine tricked them. Since large Ukrainian formations were also spotted near the border crossing of Rylsk and in the region northwest of Kharkiv, the Russians didn't know if what they faced was a diversion or the main axis of attack. In the days leading to the offensive, local Russian reports did mention an unusual accumulation of enemy forces, but the information did not rise through the hierarchy. Day 2, August 7. Overnight, Russian intelligence got frightened when they noticed how the Ukrainians were transporting all their logistics into the breachhead, like supply trucks, field kitchens, field hospitals. This wasn't a small raid. The Ukrainians intended to stay there for a while, especially since they considered the region of Kursk to be part of their historical sphere of influence. Despite the disaster, Russian telegram channels coped by spreading optimistic reports. There was no second wave. All combat enemy forces were exhausted yesterday. Lies. While they were writing this, in the early hours of the 7th of August, a Ukrainian battalion of the 103rd Territorial Defense Brigade, reinforced by elements of the Georgian Legion, crossed the border. Here we can see these Georgian volunteers operating one of their mortars, while this 14-man infantry squad is resting in some tree line. They took position on the western flank of the breachhead to act as a security element and allow armored units to continue their cavalry charge. By 1 p.m., the Ukrainians had captured Nikolaevo Darino, Ubokhovka, Lyubomiivka, Lyubimovka, Nizhny Klin, Sverdlikovo, and Lebedevka. As part of psychological warfare tactics, we could see Ukrainian infantry units recording themselves at the entrance of numerous villages, while others recorded symbolic actions like removing the Russian flag from various administrative buildings. On this other map, we can see how the Ukrainians broke through 2 defensive lines and bypassed or destroyed 8 large fortified bastions. Just like on day 1, the only thing the Russians could do while they mustered their reserves was to inflict as many casualties on these mobile columns with airstrikes, like in this video, this one, and this one, which dealt some serious damage to Ukrainian vehicles. Local units of border guards and various Russian National Guard troops counterattacked against the Zeleny Shliach farm, but they were repulsed. At this point, the Russian command scrambled any units they had available in the sector. As a follow-up, the Ukrainians reacted quickly. One column of 8 armored vehicles launched a blitz along the Rylsk-Sudzha highway towards Karenieva and reached the outskirts of this strategic town. However, Russian defense had already consolidated and the Ukrainian assault was pushed back. This strategic town was only defended by a battalion-sized unit made of cooks, mechanics, and truck drivers who barely knew how to fire their AKs. Yet, they held the line a bit like the British during the Battle of the Admin Box in 1944 in Burma. A second armored column was sent forward, identified as being equipped with Cougar MRAPs, accounted about 8 units. They were geolocated along this tree line 12 kilometers east of Karenieva. Unfortunately for the Cougars, a Russian drone coordinated a deadly artillery barrage and fired a first round of cluster munitions, followed by more strikes. In the end, the bulk of the vehicles of this column were destroyed. The fate of the accompanying infantry is unknown, but you can guess the number of casualties. With all this taking place, Ukraine launched a second front. In the morning, the BTG of the 80th Air Assault Brigade pushed to secure the road leading to Sudzha. We can believe that a mechanized company attacked to finish off the checkpoint, while 2 others bypassed the position from the north. The Russian border guards at the checkpoint were encircled and pinned down under heavy mortar and artillery fire. Eventually, they raised the white flag. That's how this group of about 40 Russian soldiers surrendered. These images soon went viral on social media.
The walls both are destroyed!
In reality, these men were low-tier fighters. Conscripts, police officers, border guards, and truth be told, they fought extremely well against the odds. Meanwhile, light infantry units crossed the border and captured the village of Olishnia. After that, Ukrainian Telegram channels started spreading rumors that they had captured hundreds of other Russian POWs. It wasn't true, but it galvanized support for them. These Ukrainian soldiers of the 80th Air Assault Brigade even managed to capture this intact Russian T-80 BVM tank. The mobile armored columns then rushed towards Sudzha, and by 6 p.m. gained partial control of the western outskirts of the town. In the north, Korenieva was under heavy pressure but remained under control of the Russian armed forces as of the evening. There were also rumors that Ukraine deployed engineering equipment meant to build serious defensive fortifications inside that bridgehead. Once again, it wasn't an incursion. They were there to stay. For me, one of the most interesting aspects is the amount of heavy weapons the Ukrainians managed to deploy for this operation, all the while maintaining operational secrecy. Pretty impressive. Day 3, August 8. By day 3, this Kursk offensive went viral. Ukraine forces were spotted everywhere across the map. And because of all these Telegram reports, a number of Russian units just fled from their combat positions. During the night of August 7 to the 8th, Ukrainian formations brought up additional reserves, mainly elements of the 88th Mechanized Brigade. Russian state TV wanted to reassure the public, pushing the narrative that reinforcements were on their way. They released the following footage. By doing this PR stunt, they literally geolocated their own troop movement to the Ukrainians. Surprise, surprise, shortly after this column got struck by Ukrainian HIMARS just east of Rilsk in Oktyabrskoye. We even have footage of the first strike on the column with all the vehicles literally parked back to back, like they used to do in February 2022. We see dozens of Russian soldiers running away, some trucks managed to drive off, but as you can see here in the aftermath, about 13 vehicles got obliterated. I think most troops were out of the trucks by that time, but still you can imagine the carnage. Russian Telegram channels reported how this Ukrainian task force was composed of numerous units, like the 80th and 82nd Air Assault Brigades, the 22nd and 61st Mechanized Brigades, but also elements of the 150th Mechanized Brigade, the 5th Assault Brigade, the 101st Mechanized Brigade, and even the 24th Mechanized Brigade. This psychological warfare tactic of combining elements from different brigades added extreme confusion to the Russian side, as this force theoretically represented over 15,000 men, all pouring into Russia. In contrast, the actual order of battle estimated by day 3 consisted of about 27 mechanized companies, or roughly 2,000 to 3,000 soldiers. The battalion tactical group of the 80th Air Assault Brigade continued its attack against Sudzha, which was reportedly defended by multiple companies of the Russian 488th Motor Rifle Regiment. They held on the eastern part of town, on the other side of the river. Ukrainian motorized columns regrouped on the western side of Sudzha along tree lines to evade detection. The goal was to reform a new strike force and storm the eastern part of town. Capturing Sudzha would allow the Ukrainians to have a new logistics hub for the entire offensive. However, just like in the board game Battleship, once you spot one unit, you know the others are nearby. That's how Russian Lancet kamikaze drones harassed this column of Ukrainian vehicles on the western entrance of Sudzha. 2 other units were immediately targeted near this forested area as well as in Rubanshina. From this footage we can also see that this Ukrainian grouping benefited from extra firepower with these tanks. And even a BBM, basically MRAPs and armored vehicles like we have seen so far. A lot of the armored personnel carriers used in this operation were Ukrainian-made Cossack 2 vehicles. Each one of them can transport 6 fully equipped riflemen. So to transport a platoon of 40 infantrymen at once, it would require 7 Cossack 2 APCs. Also think at the amount of fuel required just to keep these units moving. Meanwhile, the Free Russian volunteers were held in reserve. Let's say they're not going to be the first ones for the initial breakthrough due to their past performances. That's how on day 3, Free Russian companies also entered the battlefield at this moment. They crossed the border south of Oleshnia and pushed for the Reka Suja River. Here you can even see one of their armored units composed of 4 vehicles cutting across field. Part of these Free Russians pushed towards Goncharovka. Eventually they reached the town's center according to this Russian drone footage. Also notice how easy it is to camouflage armored vehicles in an urban area. You really have to zoom in. Meanwhile, a second grouping of Free Russians managed to reach the villages of Mirnie and Bondyarivka behind enemy lines. On top of that, their eastern flank was protected by remote mines placed along the Suja-Belitsa road. As you can see here, the rivers in this area are easy to cross as they're very narrow, and the forested areas camouflage all the movements. Now the goal was to complete the encirclement of this battalion garrison of the 488th Motor Rifle Regiment. That's how Ukraine activated another of its battalions held in reserve. They bypassed Suja from the north and turned Russian positions. And that's how they ended up on the R200 road linking Suja to Kursk, thus cutting off the supplies going to the Suja garrison.
All hope is failing, my lord!
You can bet the Russian garrison was not pleased to be tickled like that in their rears, especially since that was only the tip of Ukrainian forces. However, important notice, despite being encircled, these Russian motor rifle units did not surrender, and this would prove extremely important later on, just like during the initial Russian invasion of Ukraine. The encirclement was flimsy. The area around the town was not 100% under Ukrainian control, mainly the main roads and highways. We know this because Russian war reporter Alexander Kots managed to reach Suja without seeing any Ukrainian troops. The next Ukrainian objective was now to secure the urban area of Bolsho-Soldatskoye. By taking control of this highway, they could literally aim for Kursk. In the northern sector, the battalion of the 103rd Territorial Defense took position near Obuchovka. This allowed them to protect the flanks of this tactical grouping composed of about 9 mechanized companies. Russian drones definitely spotted some of these units, like here, where they target German-made Marder IFVs with multiple Lancet kamikaze drones. Or this other unit that was targeted by a missile strike in the village of Darino. The key for the Ukrainians was to keep moving forward, or they would become sitting ducks. This offensive was definitely well organized. Logistics units managed to establish a lot of point of supplies, as far as possible as they can, in order to keep all these motorized units rolling. Out of these dozens and dozens of ammo dumps, one got targeted by Russian artillery. One part of this mechanized grouping, made up of 3 companies, advanced towards Malaya Lokhnia. There the attack was so rapid that the bulk of the garrison just fled. Russian drones did spot a small recon force 4 kilometers east of Malaya Lokhnia. I know it's repetitive, but these vehicles were also targeted by drones. Eventually, this village would soon become the new concentration point of the Ukrainian offensive. Apparently, one of the columns that departed Malaya Lokhnia to push north fell into an ambush and had to pull back. Meanwhile, the second grouping, combining units of the 54th and 82nd Brigades, went westwards towards Korenevo. But these damn Russian cooks and dishwashers held the line once again. Due to the fog of war, reports mentioned how Ukrainian armored units reached the center of Korenevo. Some even said the town had been captured altogether, but in the end local Russian forces repelled the attack, and the Ukrainian strike force was forced to withdraw back to the Novo-Ivanovka line. By the end of the 8th of August, pro-Ukrainian Telegram channels showed this entire area under Ukrainian control. Although it was not 100% accurate, you can get a clear idea of the extent of the breakthrough, 15 km deep by 15 km wide. It was a pure military debacle for the Russians. Meanwhile, pro-Russian Telegram channel Rybar mentioned the grim reality on the front and the extent of the Ukrainian breakthrough. They mentioned that the simplicity of the Ukrainian tactics surpassed the capabilities of the Russian army. At the same time, Rybar mentioned that by the end of day 3, we could see an increase of Russian counterattacks, the main problem being the lack of coordination. At the same time, we could question how the armed forces of Ukraine would be able to continuously supply all these spread out motorized units with fuel, ammunition, organized rotations, and bring back the wounded. Because if this logistics flow slowed down, the entire operation would come to a halt. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about casualties because we don't know. but it's sure that both sides suffered significant casualties in the first 3 days. And remember that maneuver warfare is extremely costly, much more than the trench-by-trench fighting we can see on the Donetsk front. Day 4, August 9. Like firefighters, veterans of the PMC Wagner entered the battlefield as first responders. There were also some French foreign volunteers from the Normandy-Niemen UAV company. Russian reserves started forming in the towns of Bolshoye Sodatskoye and Belitsa. From there, they immediately launched counterattacks. It seems the Ukrainians were surprised at the speed of the enemy reaction. Important note, most of these Russian reinforcements were reserves attributed to the Belgorod sector. They were not withdrawn from the Donetsk front. Once the Russian command understood that the attack on Kursk was not a diversion, that's when they deployed the first reserve units. Here we see a Ukrainian soldier posing in front of a popular convenience store chain in Sudzha, marking solid Ukrainian control on the western side of the Rika-Sudzha river. The immediate objective for the Russian command was to unblock the friendly battalion in Sudzha. One mechanized detachment was tasked with clearing the R200 road, while another pushed north from Belitsa. The Northern Relief Column tried to dislodge the Ukrainian mechanized battalion from Martinovka. Apparently on their way there, the Russian motorized column got ambushed by ATGM units hidden around Kruglik, and possibly by Ukrainian tanks observing the road. The Southern Relief Column surprisingly faced little resistance. They bypassed the detachment of Free Russian light infantry deployed in Mirny and launched a surprise attack on the hospital in Goncharovka. At the same time, units of the encircled garrison carried out a sortie. The Free Russians and other light infantry units, special forces, DRGs, that had been on the east bank of the river for 2 days now, found themselves tactically encircled. While trying to encircle Sudzha, in response to avoid the disaster, they quickly withdrew back across the river. The Ukrainian command focused artillery strikes in this sector and deployed a reserve battalion to counterattack. They repulsed the Russian attack against Goncharovka. This came at a cost of a Ukrainian M777 howitzer destroyed by 2 drones near Milovoye. Ukrainian units also managed to bring tanks up to the village of Cherkaskoye Poreshnoye, a settlement 5 kilometers west of the R200 road. One of these tanks was ambushed by kamikaze drones and was eventually destroyed. Ukrainian units started swarming in the sector. Ukrainian reconnaissance units and their artillery observers took position in the next door village. That's how they supported friendly units in this sector with very precise artillery strikes. Oh, talking about artillery, the Ukrainians also made sure to redeploy their batteries forward so that they can stay within range and provide direct fire support for their advancing formations. We know this because one of their self-propelled howitzers was ambushed in a forest near Kozakia Loknia. Also notice the use of civilian cars by Ukrainian forces. You see, being positioned behind the settlement of Kazakia Lokia is perfect for M777 towed howitzers. That way they will be within range to provide fire support for most of their assault formations. Overall, we covered how Ukrainian units consolidated their gains around Cherkaskoye Poreshnoye, and now we faced a similar situation west of Malaya Loknia. Once again, the Russians had no units in this sector to counterattack, and if they did, they were just too far away. So the only thing they could do was to drop some good old FAB bombs. Did they hit anything? Don't know. But this was a soothing sight for pro-Russian Telegram channels.
A great success!
Meanwhile, in the northern sector, a mechanized company of the 82nd, reinforced with an armored platoon from the 80th, failed to storm Koreneva. During this operation, Ukrainian F-16s also provided close air support for the ground forces, namely by dropping their French-guided AASM Hammer bombs. Sadly, during one of these combat missions, 27-year-old Captain Alexander Migula was shot down. He had completed more than 160 sorties. By the end of day 4, we could notice that the Ukrainian command went on some sort of 24-hour tactical pause in order to regroup and repel enemy counterattacks. The next day of this operation would prove to be crucial, because Ukrainian formations cannot allow themselves to be bogged down, and the failure to capture Koreneva proved to be a big problem, since it was a large urban center that controlled the road leading to Rilsk. In other words, a lot of the plans had to be redrawn. However, we also have to praise Ukraine's logistics planning of the operation. engineering units were able to recover a good number of abandoned armored vehicles for repair, like this Mada IFV, this Max Pro MRAP, and this French-made VAB. Like I told you, Ukraine learned from its past mistakes. Day 5, August 10. Due to Russian reinforcements, the Sudzha sector started becoming more static, with lots of positional fighting. This was dangerous since Russian artillery could then pulverize Ukrainian formations with their firepower. We can also mention how this unit of Georgian volunteers captured the village of Poraz, probably a diversion maneuver to attract Russian forces away from the main center of attention, as it was located 60 kilometers away from the main battlefield. From an operational perspective, the Russian command once again focused on unblocking Sudzha. To do so, they had to eliminate the Ukrainian stronghold in Martinovka at all costs. Elements of the 810th Separate Guards Marine Brigade were tasked with this mission. The stronghold was defended by an estimated 2 to 3 Ukrainian companies. As for the attack force, we're talking about a battalion. Essentially a 1v1 with the defender benefiting from an urban defense bonus. The Russian Marines sent out a recon force to test enemy dugouts and defenses. They were pushed back, but a couple hours later, Marine assault detachments left Pushkarnoye towards Mikhailovka, and from this high ground swarmed into Martinovka. The Ukrainians had to abandon much of their combat positions. Here we see Russian Marines patrolling the streets of the village they just captured. The R200 road to Sudzha was secure for now. We can mention a renewed attempt by Ukrainian light infantry units to flank Sudzha by the south. That's how a Max Pro MRAP was spotted and destroyed north of the village of Guevo. Ukrainian troops secured that village and then used the cover of these forested areas to cross over the Psel River. Meanwhile, Ukrainian riflemen were already geolocated on the other side of the river in Makhnovka, a neighborhood probably named after the famous Ukrainian anarchist revolutionary commander Nestor Makhno. Anyway, after this infiltration and surprise attack, the Ukrainians captured a number of Russian soldiers. From an operational level, the Ukrainian offensive along the Korenieva front was stalling, and the situation in Sudzha was complicated. So to avoid being pinned down and to break the deadlock, the Ukrainian command decided to push right in between Korenieva and Sudzha. Like in pure maneuver warfare, they decided to bypass these urban areas. The Russians shelled the Ukrainian DRG unit near Semenovka, 14 kilometers north of Malaya Lokhnia. They also spanked this MRAP threesome with Lancet drones in Zhuravli. And lastly, this Ukrainian tank was destroyed by drones in the vicinity of Otradnoye. This means by day 5, Ukrainian units were geolocated here, here, and here. With this regained mobility, they could perhaps even flank the Russian incoming reserves. And why not be bold and strike the new objective of Rgov? That would cut off the Russian garrison of Korenieva and allow Ukrainian forces to be within striking distance of Kursk. In order to carry on the offensive, Ukraine sent additional reinforcements into the breachhead. The task force is now estimated at 5,000 to 6,000 men. Day 6, August 11. That day, as Russian reserves poured into the area of operations, the Ukrainian advance became significantly harder. On top of that, the Russian Air Force kept striking at Ukrainian supply columns, making it even harder for them to carry on their offensive. On day 6, Russian forces launched a local counterattack and reclaimed the village of Kremyanoye. This was confirmed by one of their patrols passing by Ukrainian casualties. 4 kilometers to the west, Russian artillery shelled this forested area, which they believed housed a number of enemy units. They also bombarded with cluster munitions these woods north of Lyubimovka. I'll be honest, I feel oftentimes the Russian artillery just fired blindly at all the forested areas. Like here, we don't see anything with this drone footage. Maybe they destroyed one vehicle here, and even that's not very clear. The Ukrainians definitely used this to their advantage. During the day, 2 mechanized companies of the 82nd tried to outflank Korenieva, but once again they were stopped on the outskirts. More Ukrainian reinforcements converged toward Korenieva for support, like this one composed of 5 units, with 1 tank leading and 4 armored troop transports behind. This column was hit by cluster munitions, but I think Russian artillery missed the mark and the Ukrainian vehicles scattered away. We can also mention an ambush laid by the Chechens of the Akhmat detachment and Russian Marines of the 810th Brigade. Together they destroyed the Ukrainian supply convoy in the sector of Martinovka. With the loss of that last village, Ukrainian forces regrouped in Cherkaskoye Poreshnoye. Here we see a column pushing forward with the tank leading, 2 MRAPs following it and riflemen behind. This formation quickly had to scatter after being spotted by Lancet drones. These drones are one of the most important tactical evolution for the Russian armed forces. We could think that the Ukrainian 2022 Kharkiv counteroffensive might have gone very differently if the Russians had all these drones available. By day 6, the Ukrainian offensive had stalled around the urban areas of Sudzha in the south and Korenieva in the north. To break the deadlock, Ukrainian columns continued to expand their area of control northwards towards Lgov. Meanwhile, Ukrainian DRGs and light infantry units in the sector of Guevo managed to bring vehicles on the other side of the river. That's how they captured the towns of Plehovo. Here you can see the faces of the Ukrainian soldiers that accomplished this mission. Day 7. August 12. Russian drone teams slowly regained control of the battlefield, thus preventing Ukrainian columns from moving as freely as they could in the first few days. Meanwhile, as you can see with this before or after, Ukraine is seriously digging in all across the positions they gained. So from the options I laid in the introduction, I think they will choose option 2. Day 7 of the offensive was marked by an attempt by Ukraine to break the deadlock around the town of Sudzha. After days of fighting, it seems the Ukrainians managed to get a hold on the east side of the river. Here we can see a Ukrainian vehicle driving in the city center, while another was spotted on the eastern side of town. Apparently the remainder of the Russian motor rifle battalion fell back and is now only holding on to Mirny. The large urban area of Sudzha can now be turned into an important logistics hub to carry on the entire offensive. Now the tactical problem for Ukraine was that Russian reinforcements were regrouping southeast of Sudzha, so Ukraine launched another blitz. Out of nowhere, Ukrainian army units crossed the border. Russian artillery was on high alert, and this grouping got seriously pinned down as they attacked the Kolotlovka checkpoint. However, the Ukrainian forces were too numerous and too fast. The second wave carried on the attack and advanced 13 kilometers. That's how they entered the village of Giri. However, the dream quickly crumbled. In this video, we can see a Ukrainian BTR-4E deployed north of the village. Once it got hit, everyone inside quickly ran away. On top of that, Russian civilians filmed all the Ukrainian movements and obviously reported all the information to their armed forces. Flashback from February 2022. Swarms of drones then hunted down these BTR-4s, and by the end of the day, Ukraine had lost 7 units destroyed. As you can see in this video, another one was even captured under the cheering crowd of Russian soldiers. In the north, Russian forces counterattacked out of Korenieva and regained the village of Snagost. That's the second village they recaptured in this area. During these counterattacks, a number of Ukrainian soldiers were captured. Ukrainian armed units in Olgovka tried to encircle Korenievo via Toplino, while a second grouping in Cherkaskoye Poreshnoye is trying to cut off the R200 highway further north. From an operational perspective, the important information is that a large concentration of Ukrainian armored units was now forming near Otradnoye. With a quick blitz, they captured the villages of Shapochnikovo, Semyenovka, and Levchinka, 25 kilometers from the demarcation line. After a week of operations, the great danger for Ukraine would be a Russian concentration of reserves on the Rilsk-Gloshkovo axis. From there, they could launch a devastating flanking operation and cut off this entire Ukrainian task force. You can be reassured the Ukraine command is aware of this threat. They tried to destroy the bridge in Glushkovo with a missile strike, but it seems the bridge is still standing. Days 8 and 9, August 13 and 14. In the 2 last days, the Ukrainian command focused on dealing with the threat of an encirclement on their left flank. That's why they launched an operation to take Glushkovo. They're not there yet, but they did capture 3 new settlements in the process. With that being said, Ukrainian forces need to break the deadlock around Korenievo at all costs, since it's the only real way to stabilize their left flank. Meanwhile, as Ukrainian mobile units continue their advance on Lgov, one of these columns got ambushed by the Marines of the 810th Naval Brigade near the village of Kauchukom. In the end, it was a disaster. Reportedly, the Ukrainians lost 11 armored vehicles and most of the infantry component. That's all I have for you today. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to support my work, make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal. The link is in the description below.